I'm Chuck Lind. I'm an outreach volunteer for Simply Living, and I'm here to start a recording of our presentation by Mort Schmidt called Ohio Broadleaf Tree Identification, Part 1. And I appreciate the opportunity for bringing you this because I think as environmentalists, we all need to know our trees. I'm among those who don't know nearly as much as I should. So I think if you watch this presentation, it will enlighten you about a lot of things about trees that you didn't know. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mort, who will introduce himself and run through the slideshow for you. All right, Mort.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Rita, for bringing all this together. And now I want to thank the listeners for listening in. So my name is Martin, but I've gone by Mort Schmidt all my adult life. I'm a retired geologist. I have a master's and bachelor's from Ohio State. I spent 9 years in the oil industry before the environmental business really picked up. And I spent the next 30 as an environmental consultant. I have no real credentials. I have no training, official training in forestry, but like most geologists, I have a love of the outdoors and of nature, and of course of science, and I follow several generations of woodworkers, so I think the love of trees and wood comes natural to me. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. So let's see here. Here we go. I think I can put this.
Yeah.
I keep popping the power cord. That's okay. We've got a battery on there. Maybe not an hour's work. So now the arrow is not, why is it not progressing?
You want to pause it a minute, Chuck? Technology difficulties.
Discuss. Basically, before we talk about which tree is which, we have to agree what is a tree. We talk about why we care about which tree is which. And also at the high level, we want to know which are broadleafs and which aren't, which are conifers. I'll go through the primary features for tree recognition, the alternate versus opposite, simple versus compound, leaf veins, leaf shapes, those things that you need to understand the concepts of before you can identify trees. Oh, there we go. 2 fingers, I guess. Huh? I'll talk about flowers and fruits, bark, tree shapes, leaf scars, buds, and various miscellaneous identification features. And obviously I should mention here where I'm going to talk the general principles here. And then on Wednesday, the 23rd, I'll go through 50 trees in a little over an hour, 50 Ohio trees. And I won't have time to go through in detail for all of those, but I'll give you a couple of salient features that'll help you recognize each. In the latter part of this hour, after we talk about the principles of tree identification, I'll talk about some websites that are good for tree ID, downloadable books and guides, books actually made of trees, not hardcover, but hard copy books, and some nature walks and talks you might enjoy. So why do we care about identifying trees? First of all, you can promote native plants for healthy habitats. I know that a lot of people in Simply Living I'm sure they all care about the environment, and if you want to have it healthy, it helps to have the proper plants that'll do well here. You'd like to be able to eliminate invasives. You have to know which are which. And if you're using tree products, all of us do at some level, you want to know the difference between maple and oak, et cetera. You want to know in terms of not just lumber, but fuel, fruits and medicines. You want to know which tree is which. I'll mention here too, if you've got any questions, I have the number of the slide in the lower right corner. This is slide number 4. Jot that down, keep track of it, and it'll be easier for you to ask me questions later on. So the definition of a tree, according to the US Forestry Department, it's a woody perennial plant. Banana tree is not a tree by that definition. It's a lot of inflated tubes, but there's no real woody substance in there. And that's why in Ohio, when it gets freezing to the freezing temperature, they'll completely wilt and go down to the ground. There's nothing woody holding them up. So it wouldn't really be a tree by that definition. It has to be 13 feet or taller, that's 4 meters. and 3 inches in diameter at breast height. And it has to have a single main trunk, although there are exceptions. Throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about exceptions because nature doesn't care about our rules. Nature is only really trying to survive, and it'll do whatever it has to get by. We like to classify things. We like to have a couple or 3, not too many categories that are discrete and simple, but nature doesn't always work that way. At the high level, next highest level, what is a broadleaf tree versus a conifer? Well, a broadleaf is anything that's not a conifer. Generally speaking, conifers have cones. In fact, well, they all do, but they don't all look like cones to the untrained eye. This juniper, for example, has berries. These technically function as cones. I can't tell you, and even the forestry majors I've talked to typically couldn't tell me why this is a cone, but you do see the needle-like structures on it, this juniper, and it even has a kind of smell. This would be a juniper. This would be a conifer, fairly obvious. We use the term evergreen for conifers many times and deciduous for the broadleaf trees, but it isn't that cut and dry. That's not cut and dry either. Larch and bald cypress are 2 trees that grow in Ohio. I have them in my backyard. They shed their needles in the winter, so they're not really evergreen. Not all of them are, most, but not all. As to the broadleafs, we often call those deciduous, but they don't always fall off in the winter. Some in the south, especially like the live oak, hold on to their leaves year round. In Ohio, the holly, which is a broadleaf, keeps its leaves in the winter. And so it's not really a deciduous tree, not all of the time, but we use the term deciduous for the broadleaves. When you're getting into when you're at the lumber yard, you're talking about woodworking, we use the term softwood versus hardwood. Conifers are softwoods, broadleaves are hardwoods. But the softwoods aren't always softer. The hardwoods aren't always harder. I have a table that, well, we'll discuss that later. Chuck Willer has made available to you, but I have a table where I show various tree properties, among them the wood hardness. And I rank them from softest to hardest. This is a small part of that total table. All of the trees on that, except for the softest and the hardest for reference purposes, all of those other trees are Ohio trees. And I rank them from softest to hardest. You'll see the softest tree in the world, balsa. This is the one that used to make little wind-up airplanes out of with a rubber band propeller. That is a hardwood because it has leaves. It's not a conifer, but it is not a hard wood. It's extremely soft, as you probably know if you remember it. The hardest wood in the world, one of 100 so-called ironwoods, but the hardest wood, lignum vitae, is way down at the bottom right of the full table. And it's much harder than any trees we have in Ohio. In general, the softwoods are softer, hardwoods are harder, but it's not strictly, the softwoods aren't strictly softer. So if I'm not talking to a woodworker, I don't use that term so much. If you look at this table of Ohio trees, except for the balsa, the softest wood in Ohio is the northern white cedar. I have a letter C next to it, it's a conifer. But the next 3 softest woods in Ohio are quaking aspen, yellow buckeye, black willow. Those are so-called hardwoods because they're not conifers, but they are not hard woods. White pine is the next, that's a conifer. Then the next softest woods, basswood, aspen, cottonwood, butternut, soft woods, but they're not softwoods. So you've got to really be careful. I don't use the term softwood for conifers, hardwoods for broadleafs all that much because of the possible confusion there. Speaking of hardness, wood hardness, this is a table. I'm sorry, this is a graph made from the table, part of which you saw in the previous slide. That upper right red square, that is the hardest commercially available wood. That is lignum vitae, which means it's the Latin name. Lignum vitae is Latin for living stone. The softest known wood, the balsa, is the red square on the lower left. All those blue dots in between, those are Ohio trees, and the conifers, The softwoods, supposedly, are on the left side. They're the softer ones, and the hardwoods are on the right side and mixed in with some of the conifers on the left. I show hardness on the horizontal axis. This is the Jonca hardness, and density on the vertical axis. You can see there's a very good correlation between hardness and density. And it's interesting, if you read about wood, a lot of the tree books talk about wood properties and wood hardness. The discussions always start with the word hardness and end with the word density or specific gravity, which is more or less interchangeable. Let's say, for example, that walnut is a moderately hard wood with a density of 0.55 grams per cubic centimeter. That's a good correlation, and it's a whole lot easier to weigh and determine the density, to weigh and measure the volume and determine the density of a wood than it is to measure the official hardness. Jonca hardness is measured by taking a steel ball of a certain diameter, pressing it into a piece of wood until it's buried halfway into the wood. And at that point, the amount of pressure you're applying is the Jonca hardness. In this case, it's given in pounds-feet, which is the English unit. And again, it's a good correlation. You can get a good idea of the hardness of a wood just by hefting it. It's a whole lot easier to measure the density, or at least estimate it, than it is to measure the hardness. But hardness and heaviness go pretty much hand in hand with lumbers, whether it's softwood or hardwood. Just one other example here of the confusion between conifer and broadleaf. I'm using the term broadleaf here for the non-conifers, with one exception that I'm aware of. The conifers have needles, the broadleaves have leaves. Excuse me, but here's an exception. The oldest living tree in terms of, well, the one that's evolved the least is the ginkgo. The one that we have now, the ginkgo, goes back as a genus. The ginkgo goes back to the Jurassic, which is the middle of the time of the dinosaurs. It has not greatly changed since that time. This guy is a conifer. You won't see obvious cones on it. It has a fruit, which an anatomist, a botanist who takes one apart, I guess, would recognize as having the characteristics of a cone, but it doesn't look to the untrained eye like a cone. It loses its needles, so it's not, it loses its leaves in the winter, so it's not an evergreen, but it is a conifer. And it's got an odd veining characteristic too. We'll talk about that a little later. But the other tree leaves have veins that either run down the middle of the leaf and have tributary veins coming off of them, or they might have several primary veins with tributaries coming off of them. But this just has a whole lot of little veins fanning out from the center. The other trees don't do that. And so it's a real oddball, the ginkgo. But it is a conifer with leaves, no less. So here's some of the terminology: conifers versus non-conifer. We use evergreen versus deciduous, softwood versus hardwood, sometimes even the term pine wood to describe conifers. That's pretty sloppy because the spruces, firs, larches, hemlocks, there are a whole lot of softwoods, a whole lot of conifers, and pine is just one group in there. And I like the term for the non-conifers, broadleafs, because with the exception of the ginkgo I just showed you, the broadleafs have leaves and the conifers have needles or something like them. So I'm using the term broadleaf here. Okay, so with that behind us, when you're identifying trees, we'll go primarily by leaves. I like to identify trees year round. I think it makes your winter walks a lot more interesting when you know what you're looking at, and they're not just a bunch of brown things sticking up out of the ground. And when you consider, you know, that the pioneers, they used to do a lot of their farming. They used to do the farming in the summer and the spring and the fall. And in the winter, they became lumberjacks. They had to recognize the trees by other traits. They would have to know the bark and other kinds of things because that's what there was to look at. And they would use the bark very heavily. But for now, for the most part, the simplest thing in most cases to identify a tree are the leaves. The first thing they're going to ask you when you go to a tree guide of any sort is they're going to ask, is it alternate or is it opposite? An alternate leafed tree will also have alternate twigs and alternate branches. And this is like a human footprint. If you look at your footprints when you've been walking in the snow, you turn around and look at your prints, it'll be left, right, left, right, left, right, as you move forward. Opposite leaves and branches and twigs are directly across from each other. Sometimes they look almost like the twig went in one side and came out the other side of the branch. So that's opposite. Come on. Yeah, there we go. The major trees in Ohio, there are a lot of shrubs as well, but the primary trees that are opposite in Ohio are the maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. We'll talk quite a bit about those in the next talk when we get to the individual trees, but the madbuck group, maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye, those are the opposite trees in Ohio. If you look at this picture of the maple, you can see the drawing of the buds. You'll notice that second bud down, there's one on the left and a matching one on the right. Farther down is a left and a right. That's characteristic of the madbucks, of the opposite. Come on. My fingers must be dry. Something here. Here we go. Okay, so the next question you'll be asked is, are the leaves simple or are they compound? A simple leaf is attached directly to the twig or the branch, or maybe even directly to the trunk with its own stem. The official term for the stem is the petiole. And that leaf falls off with its little stem or petiole at the end of the year. The compound leaf on the right has a single stem supporting 5 leaflets. That is officially one leaf with 5 leaflets. It is not 5 different leaves. That is compound. And I'll talk about the 2 different kinds of compound leaves here in the next slide. But they share a stem, and that whole process, that whole green part falls off at the end of the year. There are 2 styles of compound leaves, pinnate on the left, palmate on the right. Pinnate is feather-like. If you look at the drawing on the left, you can see 7 leaflets, 7 green blade things attached to a stem. That is one leaf, and that will all come off at the end of the year, or at least the leaflets will fall off. The stem might hang on a little while if it's persistent. Sometimes a persistent stem or persistent fruit will hold on for a while longer, but it will not sprout new leaves. It's 1 year and done. In the middle is a variation on the compound pinnate leaf. I have 7 leaflets on a stem, and then I've got 5 of those together sharing a bigger stem. That is one big doubly compound or doubly pinnate leaf. That is one leaf that'll come off at the end of the year. So in this case, I've got 35 leaflets all on individual stems and one bigger stem. That is one big compound leaf. There are 2 doubly compound leaves in Ohio. On the right is palmate. That one's easier to remember, I think, because if you look at the palm of your hand and you think about how your fingers are attached to your wrist, you've got 5 fingers attached at more or less the same point. So that you look at your hand and think of palmate. That is palmately compound. So pinnate, the leaflets are attached at various points on the stem. Palmate, the leaflets are attached to a single point on the stem, like the palm of your hand. It's actually not that complicated. It's not that hard to tell the difference, whether you've got a compound leaf tree or not. At first, it might be a little tricky. You look at a leaf sometimes. Later in the summer, you'll notice a lot of times the stems, the temporary part, the petioles, are greenish, and you'll find they're attached to a darker brown bark of the permanent part of the tree, a twig or a branch or a trunk. This time of year, early in the year, it might all be green. That's a little trickier. But what you will notice is that compound leaf trees have a consistent number of leaflets. On the left, this is a common hop tree. It's a small Ohio tree. You can see a couple of things sticking out there with 3 leaflets on it. There are virtually always 3 leaflets. and it looks almost like a big clover or maybe even big poison ivy. The second picture from the left, you'll notice I've got stems sticking out there, each of which has 5 leaflets. And you can see that they're not all attached at the same point. There's in the upper left of the second picture, you've got 3 leaflets near the end, but then you've got another 2 farther down on the stem. But all or most of those have 5 leaflets. Third from the left, I hope you recognize that. That's a buckeye, our state tree. Oops, I lost my cord again. I don't want to run out of power, so we'll stick that back on. Buckeye, there are 2 tree-sized buckeyes in Ohio, and they both have 5 leaflets. You can see those 5. You can see those 5 different leaves that have 5 leaflets each. They're compound, typically have 5, occasionally maybe more, but usually 5 leaflets. And on the right, that is a honey locust. It has about 1-inch leaflets, maybe 20 of them attached to a stem. And then you have half a dozen, maybe 8 or 10 of those stems attached to a bigger stem. It's doubly compound, but you'll see this consistency. They won't have the exact same number every time, but you'll see groupings of 3-ish or 5-ish, 7, or maybe 20 or more leaflets. That tells you it's a compound leaf tree. In the winter, you'll notice when you're walking along, you'll see on the ground a bunch of stems underneath a compound leaf tree. The leaves you've got to be careful about because leaves blow around, and I've sometimes looked underneath a tree. I knew for sure what it was. I couldn't find a single leaf that belonged to it underneath it. But stems don't go anywhere. The critters don't carry them around. Nobody's much interested in them. If you find a bunch of stems when you're walking in the winter, you know you're walking under or very close to a compound leaf tree. If you look on the right, this is a Kentucky coffee tree. It's one of those 2 I mentioned with the doubly compound leaves. It's got these distinctive seed pods we'll see in the next talk. But you have these stout twigs and you have very slender stems, which are temporary. The twigs are permanent, but the stems won't come back the next year. They won't do anything again. You can see the difference between the slender stems and the stout twigs. Usually the compound leaf trees have stout twigs because when you consider the entire leaf, the multiple leaflets and the stem that they share, they're usually pretty large. And so they need large large twigs to hold them up. So usually stout twigs are compound leaves, or maybe occasionally a very large simple leaf. And the slender twigs are more characteristic of something with simple leaves. And when I say slender versus stout, I think of a stout twig as something like the diameter of a pencil or maybe bigger. And by slender, I think of something on the order of the pencil lead's diameter. So slender versus stout. As we have palmate and pinnate compound leaves, we have pinnate versus palmate veining in the leaf. On the left is an oak. The oak leaves are pinnately veined. You'll notice I've got a central vein running up the middle of it, and it's got tributary veins coming off the sides. And those pinnate, those tributary veins are coming off at different points from the central primary vein. Whereas on the right, I've got palmate. Again, they're attached at the same point. You've got, in this case, what, I guess like 5 primary veins attached to a single point, like the way your fingers are attached to your wrist. That's palmate. You've got half a dozen primary veins with their own secondary veins. So it's pinnate versus palmate veining, just as we had pinnate versus palmate compound leaves. I don't have a toucher. What's it doing? There we go. Oops. Now I want to go the other way. Oh, yeah, I think we're good. Thank you. Leaf shapes. I don't want to get into too much more terminology. I've given you enough for one talk here, I think. I'll give you one more anyway, I guess. When you go through the tree guides, they'll talk about the edges of the leaves. They give you general outline shapes, but the edges can have no teeth. They'll often use the term entire if they're toothless. Then they'll have teeth. They can have saw teeth, which are kind of leaning over one way, doubly sawtoothed, where you have big teeth with little teeth in between them, and then lobed. Lobed are bigger things sticking out, like you probably visualize for most oak leaves. I don't know of any distinction between a small tooth, a large tooth, and a small lobe, but generally it's pretty obvious. Big lobes and smaller things are teeth. Oh, okay, they got the arrows working now. I don't have to use the 2-finger thing. Good. Leaf shapes. Again, I don't want to bog you down on terminology. Any tree guide you have will usually have a picture like this in the front or the back you can refer to. It's useful to pick up these terms as you go along, but we don't have to go through them all tonight. But most leaves are going to be, or leaflets in the case of a compound leaf tree. They're usually round or maybe elongated somewhat. They may be pointier near the tip. They may be skinnier at the base. They might be heart-shaped. So we'll talk about those, but I'll use the general terms. The next thing in recognizing trees, and this is actually the most important things in terms of classification, which I'll get to, but trees, all the broadleaf trees have flowers and fruits. They're not necessarily, in fact, they're frequently not what you think of as a flower or a fruit. This is the flower on the left. This is the flower of a box elder. It doesn't look like something you'd put in a vase. It doesn't smell like something. The reason for that is that the showy, good smelling flowers have to attract pollinators. They attract insects. And the visual indication there of these showy flowers, it's like a big bullseye, especially to the critters, to the insects that have ultraviolet light vision. They home in and on that center, and then they get the nectar and they spread the pollen. But a lot of trees come out, they blossom, and they produce fruit before the pollinators come out in the early spring. They're pollinated by wind. That's why they don't have showy flowers. They have no use for showy flowers. This thing has these little pollen making things hanging down, and they're hanging down so that they can catch the wind. What you need to be a flower is not some showy petal. You need to make pollen or you need to receive pollen. Some flowers do both. That is a flower. Fruits aren't necessarily something you'd want to carry on your lunch or make jelly out of. A fruit is something that contains a seed. These are the seeds from that same tree, or same type of tree at least. These are a type of maple seed. These are the paired seeds that you split in half and flutter down like helicopters, and the wind helps scatter them that way. But fruit and flower is a very general term in botany. It's not necessarily what we think of as fruits and flowers, but they'll all have them. And those are critical to the classification of the trees. Carl Linnaeus, the 1700s botanist and zoologist, had the idea that when he classified trees and all the other plants and animals, he thought for the plants that the flowers and the fruits were the most important thing, because flowers and fruits are essential to the species reproduction and continuation. And now, hundreds of years later, we have DNA evidence. We find out that his intuition was correct, because there have been some changes, but in general, when we look at his classification scheme, the trees and other plants that are closest together in terms of our classification scheme based on flowers and fruits are also the ones that are most similar in terms of DNA. Leaf shapes can be handy, but that they're not the primary way in which we classify things. Something else I wanted to say there, I forget. Oh well. There's one limitation, a couple limitations. The reason we don't dwell so much on flowers and fruits when we're identifying trees is that they're not visible most of the year, especially the flowers. They're typically only out for a couple of weeks. Fruits might hang on a little longer. Some of them hang on year round, but not very many. Fruits can be, and flowers can be absent some years entirely. The white oak group only produces acorns on average about 4 out of 10 years. The red oak's about 6 out of 10 years. So you might wait a long time before you can see an acorn that you could identify a specific oak with. And there's a reason for that. At least one good reason for this is that a lot of trees have mast years, or non-trees for that matter. They have mast years. The mast is the edible fruit, edible at least to animals, that they put out. And if they put out a constant crop of nuts, or in this case, in the case of oaks, the acorns, they put out a constant crop year after year, then the squirrels, the chipmunks, the blue jays would have a constant population and they might eat them all. Whereas if they have mast years and they have lean years in between, then the squirrel populations would be limited by the availability of food in the lean years. And then in the fat years and the mast years, there'll be more acorns than they can eat, and that's an opportunity for the oak trees to sprout up. Another limitation of using fruits or flowers for identification is that they can be different on different trees within a species. There are a number of trees, for example, mulberry or Osage orange hedgeapple, that have separate trees for male flowers and another tree with female flowers. You can wait a long time underneath a male tree for fruits and you're never going to see any. Only the females yield fruit of the dioecious trees. And leaves have the advantage of being generally more recognizable. Some are not at all diagnostic, but in general, you can recognize a tree, you can identify it most of the year with its leaves. So having given you some of those principles of opposite versus alternate, compound versus simple, pinnate versus palmate, compound and veining, let's go through. I'm going to show you a few websites that I particularly like for identifying trees, and we'll use several of those traits. My single favorite website for identifying trees in Ohio is the Missouri A to Z Nature Guide. And I give you links. We have available I put together a review of my favorite tree websites, downloadable books, and actual hard copy books. And there are links in those. The links might not always work. I had trouble with that sometimes, but anyway, you can do a Google search. I usually just do a Google search, Missouri A to Z Nature Guide. It's out of St. Louis, and they have just a great website, as I'll describe in a minute here. But let's say I have this site. I have this particular leaf, and I know that it was alternately arranged on a leaf. It was simple. It didn't appear to be in groups of 3 or 5 or anything like that. And it's lobed. You can see the big lobes there. They're too big to call teeth. It might have some small teeth on it, but in general, it's alternate, simple, lobed. I put Missouri A to Z field guide on my cell phone or on my computer. It'll behave a little differently from one to the other, but it'll pull up bird guides, mammal guides, mushroom guides. I'm guessing those others are good. I haven't used them, but I love the tree guide. I click on that, and it'll bring up something that looks like my page on the left. It'll pull up 4 sheets of a total of about 240 plants and shrubs and vines. I can just thumb through it alphabetically and look at the pictures. If I think I know the name, I can put the name, type the name in next to the magnifying glass there in the lower right, and it'll take me right to it. What I use most of the time when I'm trying to identify the tree is one of the key identifiers. I'll caution you here, there is just a slight difference in the behavior between how it works on a cell phone and how it works on a laptop computer or whatever kind of computer. You can see in the upper left of the left picture, there's a little funnel, which is a common icon for filters in a computer program. It doesn't work on my cell phone, at least, or my tablet for that matter. If I go down to the lower left instead, I'll see this filter pop up. I usually go in through key identifiers. I click the cross next to the key identifiers there in the right picture. And then it'll ask me, if I want, I can narrow it down a little more. Is it a deciduous tree or an evergreen? As we know, that's not a real accurate term, but is it leaves or is it needles? Or is it a shrub? I could do that. But I'm going to go to the key identifiers, and it'll bring up about maybe 25, 30 different questions. I show some of them on the right. Does it have flowers? If so, do they cluster or are they single? When do they bloom? In the spring, summer, winter? Does it have berries, cones, nuts? pod seeds? Does it have winged seeds? I don't know. All I have is the leaf. So also on the same page, but I show it on a separate page here. It asks me, okay, you don't know that. Does it have prickles? If it has thorns, you can click on that and it'll take you down to 7 plants, and that'll narrow the field down real quickly. Tree shape, if you like, I don't know. I do know that I had an alternate leaf, lobed, and it is simple. I click on those 3 things, voila, it pulls up about a dozen different trees, and simply looking at the picture on the right, I can match it to this photograph of the leaf I took on the left, and I'm guessing, yeah, that sure looks like pin oak. If I click on pin oak on the website, it'll pull up a page giving me a more detailed description of the tree shape, what the bark looks like, etc. It'll give me an option to look at photographs. I show a few here, photographs and drawings showing the acorn, the autumn leaf color, flowers, etc. Also within that page, or I think it's a connection to that page, you can look at the human connections. How is the pin oak useful to people? Ecosystem connections. How is it useful in the environment? What kind of animals eat it? What's its value to the forest community? And this is a real nice feature that some books have and some websites have, some don't, but I find very helpful, and that's a similar species. It looks quite a bit like the scarlet oak. I could click on a scarlet oak and it'll take me to that page, and I can compare them and contrast them. Or I could look at the cherry bark oak. I don't think we have that one in Ohio, but it's similar as well, and I could compare and contrast that. But it's a really great site, and surprisingly, Missouri is a little bit more southerly than Ohio, but there are very few central Ohio trees that I have not found there. The quaking aspen is one, and it's more of a northern Ohio tree, but you'll find very good similarity, and it's just a really beautiful website. Here's a website specific to Ohio, Tree Identification, the Ohio Public Library Information Network, OPLIN, and it's got the site, the website is called What Tree Is It? So if I go to that, I'm going to pick how do I want to identify it? How do I want to get to the tree of interest? Am I going to identify it by leaf or by fruit? Or do I want to go in by name if I already think I know what it is? In this case, I'm going in by leaf. So I click on the leaf icon on that left picture. Next question, basically, does it have needle kind of things or does it have a leaf? I clicked on leaf, so I go there next. Okay, here we get down to simple versus compound. Was my leaf attached to the tree in a way that makes me the groupings, or is there some kind of feature, maybe a bunch of stems on the ground if it was in the fall or winter, a bunch of stems on the ground under it makes me think it's compound? No, I think it's a simple leaf. I click on that. Okay, tell me about the lobing, which kind of comes down to, well, yeah, tell me about the lobing. Does it have no lobes like the lower middle picture? Does it have kind of odd lobes like the upper middle picture where it's different from leaf to leaf and I've got lots of lobes or multiple lobes maybe on one side, no lobes on the other side? No, it's pretty common looking. It's got the same kind of lobes on both sides of the tree, and every leaf looks pretty much like every other leaf. So I click on the middle. Finally, then on the right, does it have little tiny veins radiating out from a single point like the ginkgo in the upper right? No, there's only one tree like that. Do I have palmate veining like the middle right picture? No, I have pinnate veining where the veins come out at different points along the central vein. Click on that. And I won't go through the last couple of slides, but if you answer the next few questions correctly, you should get the pin oak. I don't like this approach as much as the Missouri filter approach, because with Missouri, you can put in any information you have in any order you want, and it'll keep narrowing down the field till you have several pictures left to look at. And you can usually very simply then get down to the actual one. Here, if you make a mistake or you're uncertain of a question early on, you're going to get lost. So I much prefer the filter to the binary sort of yes, no, big, little approach. But both are useful websites. Here's one that's good if you already know what you're looking at, or if you think you know what you're looking at, and it's limited not just to trees, it has all kinds of other plants. That's the USDA plants database. If you go to that and you type in the name, either the common name or the Latin name, in this case, pin oak, common name, and go, and it'll take me to a page showing pin oak information. The general tab shows a picture here of a leaf that looks a whole lot like the one I photographed earlier. Calls it a pin oak, gives the Latin name, etc. It talks about the group and the family it belongs to. Not all, but many or most of the trees have a fact sheet available for them. In this case, on the lower right there, I clicked on PDF. I want to see the PDF fact sheet. And it pulls up this page on the left. And again, this describes what the tree looks like, what kind of environment it grows best in, how it's useful, etc. The second tab over, if I had chosen the images, then I can look at pictures of it, fall foliage, fruit pictures, etc. One nice feature of the USDA plant database is that it gives range maps. These can be really handy. You can see there on the lower right, the range map shows that the pin oak is right at home in Ohio. That green area extends out for quite a ways around Ohio. So it's pretty reasonable to believe that that would be an Ohio tree. If I had typed in big leaf maple, I'd get a big green blotch over California, maybe some of the surrounding states. But that would make me think, you know, it probably wasn't a big leaf maple. So the range maps are really handy. Okay, so that's a few of my favorite websites. And again, I review others on that PDF document that's has been or will be made available. That'll be, I think, on the website, the Simply Living website. Not surprisingly, in terms of downloadable books now, this is something I like about trees. Trees hold still better than birds. I like birds too, but trees are easier to watch. And you can download a lot of books for free. I can't seem to do that with birds. Not surprisingly, since I like the Missouri website so much, I also like the Missouri 50 Common Trees downloadable book. And these are nice because if you have limited data or you're out of range from a cell tower or whatever, you can put these downloadable books on your phone and you don't have to carry a stack of books in your backpack. The 50 Common Trees in Missouri has most of the common Ohio trees, very nice line drawings and good descriptions of them. Another good one is Trees of Ohio, a field guide. This is available also in hard copy, free, from the Department of Natural Resources. You can contact them via mail or internet, or you can pick it up at the ODNR website, or not website, the ODNR bricks and mortar site off of Morris Road in Columbus. And you can also get them from the rangers. A lot of times if you go on a tree ID hike, they may be handing these out, or they may have some in the office if you simply ask them for them. DePauw University in Indiana has a nice guide. It's not a huge number of trees. It's maybe 26 or 7, I think, but they have good descriptions, and that's a nice one to have as well, and not too overwhelming, a good place to start. Common Native Trees of Virginia is good, and most of the trees common to Ohio. Common Trees of Pennsylvania. I've seen that in several versions, but the one with this green word trees cover spelled out in trees, that's my favorite edition of it. And then there's a good field guide to the native oaks of Eastern North America from the USDA. Those are all good downloadable free books. Also downloadable for free are the Wisconsin Urban Tree Key. This is 8.5 by 11, 2 sides, and it's really great for walking in neighborhoods. It has not only a number of the common forest trees, but it has things like Japanese tree lilac and Japanese maple, things that are not native to our forests, but you may want to identify. Notice when you look at this, you'll see they have opposite leaves and alternate leaves, and you'll be using, even on a two-page guide, you're going to want to know the opposites from the alternates. But you can see, it's looking at the picture, if you squint a little bit, you can see that some of those have a lot, some of those compounds have a lot of leaflets, some of them have 3 or 5 or something like that. New York City has a good tree guide for city trees. Again, a mix of natives and non-natives. The one you download from the website is awfully large to print at 8.5 by 11. I split it into 6 8.5 by 11 sheets that I think will be made available to you. Tree books, actual books you can carry with you to the field made out of trees. My favorite, if I had just one book, it would be the 101 Trees of Indiana. I've only been aware of this book for maybe 2 years. My only complaint is you might have to drive to Indiana to get it or send away on the internet. You don't see it in the Ohio bookstores much, but it is slim enough to fit in a large pocket, at least a jacket pocket. And it's got just the right level of detail, nice illustrations. And I think it's a very good book, especially for the intermediate user, or even the advanced one for the most part, but not too scholarly, not too hard to read. Stan Tekela's Trees of Ohio field guide. He's got tree guides all over the country and bird guides and a lot of stuff. He's covered a lot of ground. This is a good book for starting, and it's got most of the common trees in Ohio. Not a huge amount of detail, but nice illustrations. You can find it anywhere, and it costs usually a little under $10. The Trees of Indiana will run more like 20. National Audubon Guide. I'm told, ironically, that even though John James Audubon was known for birds, bird watchers don't seem to care for his bird books much, for the Audubon bird book that much. But the Audubon Tree Guide, for whatever reason, seems to be more respected. This was my go-to book for years before I found the 101 Trees of Indiana. Covers the Eastern United States. Make sure you get the Eastern edition. Little bit scholarly, and it's arranged in a way that makes it a little trickier to use sometimes, but a lot of good information, and it's got a good vinyl cover, so it'll wear well if you stick it in your pocket. I've used the same one for decades now. Woody Plants of Ohio. This is a large format book by Lucy Braun. This has been in print now since at least the 60s, and this is the Bible to me of Ohio trees. A lot of beautiful line drawings, very detailed. You can see good descriptions of buds. Buds are very good for tree recognition. I'm not real good with buds. Some people know the trees all by their buds. But it's got not only good information, a little scholarly for a beginner, I think, but it's got not only good illustrations and descriptions, but it's got county by county range maps. So you can see what parts of the state trees are most likely to grow in. Sibley is a great guide to trees. Again, a large format, a little bit to carry, maybe won't fit in your pocket, but you can put it in a backpack. Beautiful drawings. Of course, Sibley's also known for his bird guides, and not a huge amount of information, a good beginner or intermediate book, and I still refer to it. And a good book with a lot of information and yet remarkably readable, and that is the Illustrated Book of Trees by William Carey Grimm. Good line drawings, black and white, not color, but it talks about the tree uses and recognition, etc. It's got 250 trees of Eastern North America, so anything you see is likely to be in there. Great book, but not very portable. It's like an almanac. Just another few. The Tree Identification book by George Simmons. I've seen that in a lot of bookstores. Large format, not very portable. Black and white photographs, a little bit low contrast to me. They look to me like they were taken quite a few years ago, etc. But it's just arranged in a way that I found very easy to identify your tree based on flowers, fruits, leaves, whatever you have. Very quick and easy to identify your tree. It's a real good one to have. There's a companion book on brushes, on shrubs. Here's a book, America's Famous and Historic Trees. There are several others like it. I like to have it with me when I'm traveling. It talks about this particular tree had a treaty signed under it in 1785 or whatever. It's interesting to me anyway to look at these trees when you're traveling around the country and know that something significant happened there. This book, Leaves, on the third one from the left. This is a nice book, and I've seen it in bookstores at the discount table. It's fairly easy to find, but it's got a lot of good information on tree uses, tree lore, including medicinal uses. I won't give you recipes, but it'll talk about this one was used for rheumatism, et cetera, et cetera. There's an oriole on the feeder out there. This is great. And Trees Up Close is a nice coffee table sort of book. On the upper right there, it's got good micro photographs of trees in detail. So that's a really nice one to look at. Finally, last slide here, Central Ohio tree walks and sites, places to go to look at trees. I like the Franklin County Metro Park. I love them, the guided walks. They were until COVID, and I think they will be picking up again the organized walks, and hopefully they'll post those on the website. They have a tree identification walk somewhere in the county just about every month. They have a lot more than they used to, which is nice. They have one about every month. It's a good place to learn. Innis Woods Metro Park in Westerville, part of the Franklin County system. They have a lot of labeled trees. That's a nice one. One that I was unaware of, and I used to work near, and I went for a walk every day out at Glacier Ridge, but I didn't know about this place. ML Red Tribute Park is part of the Dublin system. But it's a nice park. It's got 1.5 miles or 2 miles of trails, and it has its own arboretum of 60 or 80 labeled trees. Very worth looking up. Chadwick Arboretum is part of the OSU campus. You'll have to pay to park there, but there's no admission. And they've got a lot of good trees there, and they've got several city blocks divided up with trees in each of them. So it's a good way to spend a day. This is a nice one too. I went there just earlier in the week and I was really impressed with it. That is Lower Olentangy Urban Arboretum in Clintonville. Go to their website, you can pull down PDFs, each of 2 maps, and they have streets on the map with different trees. They have all kinds of stuff, ginkgo, white oak, and lots of other trees. Most of them have a label, a concrete block underneath them with a tree name in English and Latin on them. And they have on the map, they have the actual street address of what house this is in front of. So you can't miss, it's very easy to figure out which is which. And they're just gobs of trees on there. It's a very nice walk. Just be careful which street you park on. Some of them are permit parking. I found I could park on Tibbet without any problem. Dawes Arboretum, the biggest arboretum in this area that I'm aware of, and that's in Licking County. Really nice. And finally, one other thing I'll mention, not a place, but Greta here made me aware of a nice podcast called Completely Arbortrary. It's a really nice podcast. I think they have at this point somewhere in the order of 30 podcasts, about half an hour or 45 minutes long on different trees. I found them very entertaining and informative. So if you like podcasts, I do, I suggest you listen in on those. So that's it for now. The next talk it'll run a little over an hour, but the next talk will be given live on the 23rd, Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And we'll go through 50 Ohio trees using the Palmate, Pinnate, simple compound, and the other principles we discussed earlier in this talk. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll listen in on the 23rd. Thank you.